Okay. So folks are still trickling in, and hopefully they'll just join automatically as I speak, but I'm going to jump into my introductions. So good morning, everyone. My name is Maggie Dixon. I am the Home Visiting Coordination Initiative, or HVCI Development Coordinator at Prevent Child Abuse New York. And I head up our webinar series, which we host monthly webinars to offer opportunities for learning and conversation. So this morning, we are so pleased to partner with the New York State Office of Children and Family Services, the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, and the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence for a briefing about the Safe and Together model. So before we get started, a couple quick housekeeping items. As you'll see, this session is recorded, so it will be available on our website after today's presentation. Excuse me. I will send a follow-up email with information about how to access the recording, as well as additional resources like slides, handouts, anything like that that the presenters would like to share. Please remember to mute yourselves and place questions in the chat box. And closed captioning services are available. If you navigate to the bottom of your screen and hover over the CC button, you should be able to access the live transcript. Also, I will be sending a link to a follow-up survey, which we partner for the Center for Human Services Research to collect data as part of our preschool development grant. So I'll be sending that out. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to our presenters today. We're so pleased to be joined by you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Hello, everyone. My name is Candace Calabrese, and I am from New York State Office for Children and Family Services. I actually work in the Domestic Violence Bureau here. And I have historically, I came from local district work. So I started out in child welfare in a local district as an investigator, as a preventive worker. I was a supervisor the last 7 years that I was with the district, and then moved on to training. And I came to the state, and I originally worked at the Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence, providing training to child welfare and CPS workers on handling domestic violence cases. And then came to Office of Children and Family Services and did some oversight and monitoring work. And then came into the DV Bureau and had the opportunity to work with our CPS DV collaborations, which were funded initiatives that we had for almost 20 years. And it was actually, collaborating with a domestic violence advocate with child welfare in responding to cases of domestic violence. And once we lost the funding for that, we were able to take on this new initiative, and that's training the Safe and Together model throughout New York State. And my partners in that effort are here with me today, and we want to go over a little bit about the model and how it pertains to home visitors. So Bonnie, you want to introduce yourself next?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Bonnie Allen, and I work for the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. And Candace and I did used to work together. I always forget that she used to work for the same agency that I worked for. And so it's a pleasure to be able to continue our work together in different agencies. So I have been with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence for 8 years now. And I came to the office with a lot of experience working with, I've worked with survivors in a domestic violence shelter and in non-residential settings. I've worked with children who have been exposed to domestic violence in those settings as well. I've also worked with perpetrators of domestic violence for many years in an offender accountability program. And so I feel like I've really had the privilege of being able to see domestic violence kind of through all of those different lenses. And there were times where I thought I was walking away from the domestic violence world to do work with families in other capacities. I worked for a mediation center doing custody and visitation mediations. I ran a reentry program for people that were transitioning back into the community from prison, and also a family self-sufficiency program for families who were trying to get off of temporary assistance. And so anytime I thought I was walking away from domestic violence world, but was still working with families, it became very obvious very quickly that one of the challenges and barriers that many of the families were facing in whatever setting I was working in, unfortunately, was domestic violence. And so always working with families, always there were at least some cases, if not many, where families were experiencing domestic violence. And my other work has been with all all the systems, right? We know that these are complicated, challenging cases, and that families that have domestic violence often have many systems involved in their lives. So I've worked with the healthcare system and the juvenile justice system and the legal system and the family court system. And that one of the things that I know to be true is that no one system is going to solve this problem, that all of these systems need to collaborate and work together. And that's something that the Safe and Together model really recognizes. And so it's one of the many reasons why I like this model, and I'm excited to be sharing it with you today.
And Lorianne?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, I want to echo the sentiments. I'm a big fan of the Safe and Together model and add my welcome to all of you. I'm so excited to see so many of you join us today who are interested in hearing more about the model. I am the Director of Prevention at the New York State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I've been there almost 25 years, so this month, so I'm a bit of a fixture. But I'm also faculty for a couple of national training and TA providers, one of them being Safe and Together, which is really an international training and TA, Technical Assistance Institute. So as faculty for Safe and Together, I've really seen firsthand the transformative nature of the model for all sorts of systems. So even though it started out as a training and a model for child welfare systems to adopt, I've seen provinces and states and regions all over the world really take this on and have governmental agencies and non-governmental agencies, community-based organizations really come together to speak the same language and be approaching working with families using the same principles and theories. And it's just been fantastic to be a part of the Safe and Together Institute, to see that work coming to fruition and see all the hard work that people are doing. So I believe that it's a model that's very applicable for home visitation. And I'm excited to have you here today. I'm going to go off camera and just sort of be a fly on the wall for a little bit as the presentation gets started, but I may weigh in a little bit in the chat as we get going. So thank you for having me and welcome.
Thanks, Lorianne. We're so happy to have you here. We were sharing a little bit before the presentation, just, you know, how important it is for all of our systems to come together and really unite around addressing this issue, because in all of our roles, we really are, you know, like Bonnie said, constantly coming into, you know, into context with domestic violence and the families that we're serving. So really just how is this more of a systems change program, not so much a training delivery. So we really want to talk a little bit about that today. I should have had everyone do this when we first started while we were all talking about ourselves. But if you could, in the chat, just put your name and the agency that you work at, your role there, and maybe it's just like something, one word or a statement of something that you know or believe about domestic violence, just to kind of start getting us going while we start telling you about the model, so we can have some conversations as we start rolling through here this morning. Okay, so the Safe and Together model, as Lorianne said, it's an internationally recognized training. It's a suite of tools and interventions that were designed initially for child welfare systems, but it's really more of a child serving professionals, and it's a way for child serving professionals to become more domestic violence informed. So today we'll talk a little bit about the framework of the Safe and Together model. It really provides us with a methodology or a how to approach the work to improve our child welfare competencies. So it's not just a training with some information to take and go. It's really a practical, applicable model, gives you things to actually go and take and do in the work that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, which is what I really, really love about it. You know, the Safe and Together principles and critical components can actually help us facilitate collaboration and communication by using shared language between not just child welfare, but all other community partners. So, you know, even our you know, home visiting, our substance use and mental health providers, our family courts, probation, law enforcement. It's really a way for us to be able to communicate with one another. It's a child-centered model, an adult survivor strength-based, and it derives its name from the concept that children are best served when we can work towards keeping them safe and together with their protective parent, and that's the domestic violence survivor. So the model provides us a framework for partnering with that DV survivor and effectively intervening with the domestic violence perpetrator in order to enhance safety and well-being of children. So the perpetrator pattern-based approach is really important in understanding that domestic violence is identified and defined by the behavior of the perpetrator. It's not about the relationship. It's about the behaviors that the perpetrator is choosing to engage in against their partner. It often involves coercive control and actions taken to harm children. It's beyond just physical incidents of violence. So we want you to think much bigger and think about looking at coercive control as a pattern of behavior, not an incident. And that pattern of behavior that is generally generated towards their partner, also or targeted at the adult survivor, also impacts children directly and indirectly. So we're going to talk a little bit about multiple pathways to harm and all of the ways in which, even though a perpetrator may be targeting their partner, how is that impacting the children? So making sure that we are, really doing a holistic assessment of those patterns and all of the ways in which those behaviors are harming children. And how do we intervene with perpetrators and focus on how to change them, and really looking at tying that perpetrators' behaviors as a parenting choice. We really want to, this model really does focus on highlighting accountability as a parent. It places high expectation on men as parents and puts the safety of children and the well-being of children at the very center. So we're always child-centered in this approach. It also highlights the adult survivor strength. So it really looks at what are all of those things that a survivor is doing as a protective parent in the context of her abuser's behaviors and actions, coercive control. Really looking at all of those things and keeping in account the context of other intersections and intersectionalities like substance use and mental health and culture and race and socioeconomic status. Really looking at how all of those things come into play in the dynamics of the family and how the domestic violence can impact that. So the model's framework gives us a shared language and approach that can improve outcomes for families when everyone is sharing that perpetrator pattern-based approach. It makes processes more effective and efficient. It allows us to all talk about what's going on with the family, tell the story of the family in the same way, make referrals to other systems, make more holistic assessments and better based referrals and case plans. So really looking at how are we holding men and women to the same standards of parenting, holding them both equally responsible for meeting children's needs, shifting away from that failure to protect that we have traditionally used with survivors, and really looking at behavioral assessments in our work and also in our assessments with our families. So really looking at making sure that we are, holding both parents, evening out those gender double standards and looking at both parents as to the safety and stability and nurturance of their children. So safe and together refers to the belief that children are best served when we can work to keep them safe and together with their protective parent. I mentioned that. And I think in order, with safe and together, Lorianne mentioned this a few minutes ago, this is really a global network. So this was originally a practice framework that was developed by the executive director in his work with child welfare. So he worked as a consultant with child welfare and was able to identify a lot of the common struggles that they were having when working with families experiencing domestic violence perpetration, and came up with the model principles and some approaches to how to best manage those challenges and how to best serve families. But after really putting this into practice and working with domestic violence advocates and child welfare professionals, realize that this is really a much bigger systems change type of work. And in order to achieve that shift in our approach to the way that we are working with families experiencing domestic violence, it really needs to be a systems-wide approach. And how are we going to, as a system, strengthen the safety and well-being of children and families? So looking really at how to transform our systems and using common language and a common approach, a common framework to our work with families. And again, beyond the classroom. So they really give us some practical tools. There's, so there's trainings, there's also toolkits, there's free webinars, there's things that you can use with families directly or with, with other professionals that you might work with that are all available on the website. And that'll be in some of the resource materials that we send out to you after the webinar. But really looking at that we have the ability to be powerful allies to adults and children that are harmed by domestic violence and perpetrators' behaviors, and how can we shift to make those positive changes by partnering with adult survivors, to increase safety and well-being of children, to work with perpetrators on changing their behaviors so that they can become better parents. So knowing that this is global, Lorianne mentioned that she's actually done some training in other countries, in Australia and the UK. Luckily, I have not been able to do that. Bonnie and I recently became certified trainers in this model as well. In New York State, we are really, we became a partner agency here at OCFS. We're looking to build our capacity internally so that we can continue to provide these trainings, not just to child welfare, but to other systems. So it's really, they're looking at this as, we know that domestic violence is a global issue. It's a public health issue, right? So this network of practitioners from across the globe work together to create systems change and better outcomes for families. And we're really able, in our work with the Safe and Together Institute, connect with these other providers in other countries and other jurisdictions and other states in the US to see how they're transforming their systems, to see what's working for them. And it really helps us fill in the gaps of knowledge and practice and assist all our systems in how to become more domestic violence informed and support child well-being and outcomes for children and families.
Candace, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I wondered if you wanted me to weigh in a little bit about just what some of the other countries are doing.
Yes. Do you want to do that?
Briefly.
Yeah.
I wouldn't mind. Thank you for backing up. I just wanted to say that, one of the reasons that NYSCDF is so interested and excited about this model is because, there's been, over the past 15 years, a lot of evidence that's been created about the effectiveness of doing this work, not just for child welfare, which is, let's face it, it's a bit of a paradigm shift for child welfare to even be engaging perpetrators in the first place. Historically, we know child welfare has really, the captive audience has been the non-offending parent, usually mom. It's a gender responsive model, but it's also, domestic violence is still a very gendered social problem. And so one of the things that I like about Safe and Together is that they've always been, updating the model based on what they learned from all of these folks across the world, as you see, who are implementing the program. And one of the reasons we know that it works for home visitation and home visitors who are coordinated with domestic violence programs, who have a solid, warm referral network, who are working closely with child welfare, who may be working with other support systems in the community, is because in the UK, in Australia, in Scotland, in in provinces, the Ontario province, and particularly in Manitoba in Canada, it's folks who, they may not be called home visitors, but they're family support services, or, people who go into homes to support the families, whether they're child focused or they're there to support the survivor, the non-offending parent, or whether they work with the whole family and they're also working with perpetrators. What they're finding is the governmental agencies that can hold perpetrators accountable, it's one thing to have them adopt the model, but all of these other supports are necessary. So high-risk teams are being used, and it's really just fantastic. So Ohio, over the years, it took, 5 or 10 years.
10 years.
10 years.
They're at 10, yeah.
But they started bragging about it after 5 years.
I'm sure.
They really, the whole of Ohio is using this model. And if you ask, folks at the state level, like OPDV and OCFS, and, of course, Niskanen is so excited that there's this sort of statewide and state agency interest in implementing it. But, it's really gone deeply into sort of the community-based programs in Ohio, which help for those governmental agencies to make it happen. Just one more thing that I wanted to mention is that the whole of Australia is being trained by the Safe and Together Institute. The judiciary, the whole of the judiciary in Australia is being trained. So you can see that if you could get all of these different entities to be speaking the same language and singing from the same songbook, so to speak, the kind of change that you could make that would improve outcomes for families is just tremendous. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of those things. Yeah.
No, thank you. I know. I think it's so important because I think we learn from what other folks are doing, and we've had a lot of asks in our this is the first year, that we're really of the contract that we've gotten with Safe and Together, and we're already getting so many requests, not just from other systems for presentations about it, like today, but also from the courts is a big ask, and that's a lot of that's coming specifically from child welfare. If we're going to make this change, we need to be supported on the other end too. But think about if we can get all of those other child serving systems to also be on that same page, when we're all providing and approaching it from the same angle, and making the assessments in the same way, and doing those referrals and handoffs and safety planning, and just documenting case notes and case plans and service plans. Just think about that alignment, how much better that's going to be for families to be more successful and to be safer. And I think that's a big asset for us in switching over to this model. So in New York State, we've known for a long time, OCFS is known for a long time that we really need to do better with our work, specifically with working with domestic violence cases. And that's why years and years and years ago, there was a mandate that all child protective workers had to be trained in the dynamics of domestic violence, because they just weren't. And with the overlap of cases of folks experiencing domestic violence perpetration in child welfare cases, it was so essential for them to be able to have some information about it. But what we know, so we know, the long-lasting effects and trauma that can be experienced by children that are exposed to domestic violence and community violence. And we know that workers are constantly saying these are really hard cases for us. And if child welfare workers are saying that, I'm sure workers from other service areas are saying that. I don't know how, if we had done a polling question on this, and we probably should have, I would love to know how many of you find those cases the most challenging in the work that you do on a daily basis, right? When we're going into homes, there's and working with families, it's so difficult to manage those other dynamics, and domestic violence is one of those ones that we struggle with the most. And adding to its complexity, it often intersects with other things like substance abuse and mental health issues and housing instability and physical and sexual abuse and other neglect issues. So, you know, in New York State, we know that it's the highest occurring risk factor in all of our child protective cases. The co-occurrence of child maltreatment and domestic violence is 30 to 60%. And that's national. And actually, it's actually probably much higher than that because our assessments aren't always holistic and they're often very incident based. So this model really helps us focus to a more holistic assessment of what's really going on and how the perpetrator is impacting the family. So given this data, we knew that in order to achieve our mission of child safety and permanency and well-being, we really need to improve our competencies. And improving child welfare competencies is where we're starting, right? Because that's our focus here at OCFS. But we also are recognizing that we need all of our community partners to join the efforts with us in order for us to really immerse this change systems wide so that we can all support each other in the implementation of it. Ultimately, we know that child welfare is what might bring families into other systems, other services, into courts. But we also know that those prevention programs like the ones that you are all doing can be so integral in identifying and assessing for domestic violence and really preventing future abuse and maltreatment. So how great would it be to make sure that we are really hitting this epidemic on all fronts, as child serving systems. And we know that when we were introduced to this Safe and Together model back in 2017 when we had our CPS-DV collaborations. And at the time, we had overwhelming feedback from the folks that had learned the model and implemented it. And they said, why can't this be the training for child welfare workers? Why can't this be what we all get? This seems to work. This makes sense. It gives us tools to do the work. It's really helping us with our work with each other, and we're seeing better outcomes. So in 2020, OCFS said, okay, let's look into starting implementation. Is this something that we can do? And when we lost our funding for the CPS-DV collaborations, we were able to rally and get some funding. We ended up getting a 5-year contract with Safe and Together Institute so that we can certify our own trainers as a partner agency. So that's where Bonnie and I come in. It's becoming certified, and we have colleagues both at OCFS and OPDV becoming certified. We have plans for certifying more as we roll out the next 5 years. And we have this great resource with Niskative, having Lorianne being a faculty member. So we couldn't be more fortunate to already have a nice, strong foundation of agencies that work and intersect with all of our other child serving systems to really start rolling this out and formulating a plan. So that's kind of where we're looking to go.
Candace, OPDV too is so, right, like I'm doing a lot of training. Stephanie and my colleagues, we were trained to be able to deliver this model. OCFS is doing this. Any new person that's coming into that system as part of their foundation's training gets a full day training on the Safe and Together model. And so I'm doing a lot of those trainings, and it really is very, very well received. So I do the foundations class with brand new workers, but I've also had the experience of doing what they're also rolling it out to every worker. So people who have been doing this work for 10, 20, sometimes 30 years, teaching kind of this new approach and this new way. And I will say, really, the response is really positive. Like, they like the idea of looking at the perpetrator's pattern of behavior. Like Lorianne said, it's a little like, well, what do you mean we have to work with, engage with perpetrators? Like, we don't really see them. We're not really comfortable with that. But when we go through and we do the training, they recognize how important that is. And at OPDV, in addition to partnering with OCFS to do those trainings, we have made a decision as an agency to really incorporate, or at least make any trainings that we do kind of incorporate a little piece of the Safe and Together, or at least acknowledge that we're really starting to use this model and that it can apply to all systems. And so the home visiting one is one that's near and dear to my heart. So I'm really glad that one of the places we're really starting to kind of expand this work is with you guys all, because I think it's just, having worked in homes with families and supervised volunteers and people that were going into homes, I know that this is challenging for people. And I think that this model really helps.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really does just give us a how-to, it does give us a how-to. And thank you for mentioning that, Bonnie. For years, child welfare workers were going through their initial core training with no information about domestic violence. And we know that 30 to 60% of their cases have domestic violence perpetration embedded, as a factor. So how are we, doing well by our folks that are doing this work by not giving them those tools to be able to make those assessments and really connect families with the services that they need and address the concerns. So I'm so proud that we were able to, start this work. I've seen the outcomes in some of the districts that had implemented it back in 2017. We've seen, really good practice-based outcomes from them, we've seen them in other states. So we're hoping that we can see some positive changes with our child welfare data and just really, more importantly, with the satisfaction of the families that we're working with. I think that's a data set that you don't collect very often, right? But how important is it for us to know the impact that it's having on them? And honestly, as child serving systems, we want to be able to do this work, and this model allows us to really align with our values of helping families. So that's really what I love about it. Lorianne, anything on Nisketa's front as far as other partnerships and training opportunities that you're looking into at this point?
I think that, again, we see this as a wonderful vehicle for to support coordinated community response. So domestic violence programs ask us for this training all of the time. Candace and Bonnie, we've talked about, doing an overview and doing some training for you mentioned the DV CPS collaboration. So there are a lot of people who no longer have that funding, both from child welfare and from the domestic violence program side, who are keeping those collaborations up, and they're really, really solid, and they'd like to be trained, as you're doing, trained together to do Safe and Together. So we get the same kinds of requests that you're getting. And then our hope, we've long wanted for home visitation, and for, Bonnie, you mentioned earlier to me that your folks at OPDV are training Head Start. Those are the kinds of things that we really want to support. But we feel like the domestic violence programs really need to buy in first, right? So, they really need to be able to speak to the model. And you're going to go through the overview today, so folks will hear about all of that. But the domestic violence programs need to be able to speak to the model, so that they can also influence the folks who are responding to families that might have come to the attention of child welfare, or families, talk to home visitation, or to mental health clinics, or to chemical dependency clinics, substance use disorder clinics, as you've all mentioned, so that everybody's speaking the same language. And that's really the crux of the coordinated community response. But that's how we're approaching it, is that this is one way to bring people together around, as we've said, same philosophy, same approaches, just getting everybody to sort of buy into this notion of holding the perpetrators accountable, being child-centered, being survivor-centered, having a perpetrator pattern-based approach, and thinking, a little bit more deeply about how the perpetrator is impacting the way the family functions, instead of seeing it as a deficit of the non-offending parent or a deficit of the family overall.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. So so let's get into, let's look a little bit at the principles and some of components and foundations of the model. So, we know that, this little graphic here really just gives you some of those, some of Safe and Together's, ultimate goal in implementing this practice framework. And we knew that when our DV and child welfare folks used it, they had, it definitely improved their cross-system collaboration and their work with families and their success with families. And we know that it's a model that in other states has decreased out-of-home placements and recurrence of child abuse. I know in Florida, when they implemented this practice framework fully in jurisdictions, 50% less out-of-home placements for cases of domestic violence in the first year and a half that they used it. That's pretty big. So really when it's fully integrated, they see so many positives just in how folks are documenting cases, how they're engaging with perpetrators. We're seeing less victim blaming. We're seeing, more services put in place for families that are more relevant to the behaviors that need to change. So just knowing that it's improving those things in other states and jurisdictions, and even in our counties in New York State that have started using it, we definitely know that they're seeing some of that in their work. So knowing that we've got, what this really, in addition to improving the competencies and cross systems collaboration, it provides us with a foundation of language, of model characteristics. It's definitely something that, it provides us with an approach to the work and a way we talk about the work. So those model characteristics and principles and critical components, Bonnie's going to go over those in a few moments, are things that we learn in the model, and it's very behavioral in focus. They're the foundation of the model. And then there's practice tools. Lorianne mentioned, or actually that was in our conversation beforehand. I'm sorry. There are many practice tools that we do get with this, with the actual core training that folks can use in their work with families and it really helps with things like mapping patterns and impact to children, and really being able to identify survivor strengths. Looking at ways to, provide better assessments and better case plans for families that are more relevant to the actual behavioral dynamics that are going on in the household. And, ultimately we want to see better outcomes for families. We want to have better partnerships with collaborating community partners and better case plans, and that's going to produce better outcomes. So really, learning those foundational skills, learning how to apply them through using actual practice tools, and then, how is that going to ultimately impact the work? So yeah, let's get right into the principles. Bonnie, do you want to take over here?
So these are the three principles of the Safe and Together model. The first one is keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent, right? So when we're talking about the Safe and Together model, it really recognizes that children are, if that survivor is safe, that it's more likely that the children are going to be safe, that the children's safety is often tied to the survivor's safety. So keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent is the first principle. And when they're talking about safety, they're talking about not just physical safety, but emotional safety, right? And really looking at how are we keeping those children physically and emotionally safe? How are we helping them heal from trauma? We recognize that domestic violence is trauma, and whether you're experiencing it as a child in a home or as a survivor or victim of domestic violence, that's trauma. And so this model is really looking at what is that non-offending parent, or what is that survivor parent doing to help the child stay safe physically and emotionally? What are they doing to helping them heal from the trauma of the domestic violence? And as Candace mentioned, it really looks at survivor strengths. And so there's a lot of focus on what is the survivor doing to provide stability and nurturance for the children while this coercive control is happening in the relationship, right? And one of the things that we know to be true in my experience over years and years and years of working with families, right, is that what things look like maybe on the outside versus what we're dealing with on the inside is very different things. And so it can be very easy and quick to say, like, why is to do that victim blaming stuff, right? And why isn't that victim doing a better job of protecting? But when you're really working with families and when you're partnering with survivors, which is the second principle, you start to really understand that survivors are almost every choice and decision that they make is to keep their kids safe, and that they're doing tremendous work to provide stability and nurturance for their children while they're navigating the domestic violence that's going on in the home. And Candace also mentioned that this model holds fathers and mothers to that very high standard of parenting. So when we're talking about keeping the child safe and together with the non non-offending parent and looking at the physical and emotional safety and healing from trauma and what is the survivor doing to that. This model also holds the perpetrator to that standard, right? And really in your engagement with the perpetrator is really saying to them, you are responsible, right? For providing physical and emotional safety for your children, for helping them to heal from the trauma that you have caused, right? And for providing stability and nurturance. So it looks at keeping the child safe and together with the non-offending parent, but it also holds that perpetrating parent, as Candace said, as a parent to a high standard and points out to them, right, that they are also responsible for providing these things for their children. The second principle is partnering with the non-offending parent. So you just heard me say that. I am so safe and together absorbed now that the language just flows out of my mouth all the time. And it really talks about doing that as the default position in these cases, right? And so once we've really identified who that survivor parent is, it is extremely effective for us to work with them and partner with them. They have so much information, right? No one knows better than them what the perpetrator's pattern of behavior it is, what the impact of that behavior is having on the child, the survivor, the overall family functioning, right? So it's really efficient and effective for workers to engage in conversation and partner with that non-offending parent. They have so much information to give us, right? They can tell us what the relationship is between the children and the perpetrator. They can tell us how to best and most safely approach the perpetrator, or if it's not, that's something that we need to be really, really cautious about. It's a very, Candace mentioned that it's a child-centered model, and partnering with the non-offending parent, it may seem like, oh, we're really focused on the non-offending parent and working with them. But that is child-centered, right? Because they know what their child is experiencing and they know what's going to best keep their children safe. And go back to that first principle, right? What do their kids need, right? So that they can be physically and emotionally safe. So the model constantly is encouraging, workers or people working with families to check in with that survivor parent and about, before they engage, before they do things, and really say, if I do this, how is it going to impact that, right? How is the best way for me to approach this that's going to make sure that I don't interfere with, put you at any additional risk of harm, by working with you and your family. And then the third principle is the intervening with perpetrators to reduce the risk and harm to children. What I heard Lori say it, what I love about this model when I'm training, I constantly am saying, oh, and another thing I love about this model, right? So often it's easy to ignore that perpetrator. We may see them as scary or dangerous. They often don't want to be dealing with us, right? So they may not show up, or they may disappear from meetings. They may avoid us. And so oftentimes they become invisible. And what this model constantly does is puts that focus back on the perpetrator. What is the perpetrator doing? The perpetrator is the source of risk and harm. So we really need to identify what are their behaviors, how are they impacting the family, and we want to do our best to try to engage with them in ways that are safe, right? We're going to follow the lead we're going to partner with the non-offending parent in terms of that engagement with them, and we're going to always be engaging with them in ways to hold them accountable for their behavior, right? So, and we can do that in our documentation, even if we don't see them, even if they avoid us, even if they sneak out the back door every time we show up, or they cancel or miss appointments. One of the ways that we can hold them accountable is by documenting that, right? I reached out to Mr. So-and-so and said, I want to talk to him about helping his children heal from trauma and providing stability and nurturance, and he refused to meet with me. Right. And so even in our documentation, even if we're not having those conversations, or we're not able to engage with them because they're trying to avoid us, right, we can still be holding them accountable. And if we do have the opportunity to engage with them, we want to engage with them in a way that also recognizes that they probably have some strengths as a parent, right? We don't want to approach in like an accusatory, you have to tell me every horrible thing you ever did, right? Mm-hmm. We want to approach in a way that we can start to engage with them and engage with them as a parent, and hold them accountable to that high standard of parent and taking care and providing for their kids. If the other systems, the court systems, or there's orders of protection, obviously those other systems are trying to hold them accountable. We want to reinforce that in any way that we can with the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. Encourage them to go to their offender accountability program, make sure they're not violating orders of protection. But even without those systems holding accountable, our systems, the child welfare system, home visiting systems, can hold them accountable as a parent. And this model really talks about how to do that and teaches you how to do it. And as someone who worked with perpetrators for many, many years, one of the things that we know is one place where perpetrators are motivated to change their behavior, right, is when they start to understand how it's impacting their children. And so we can also engage with them as parents to educate them about how their behavior is harming their children, right, and provide them with opportunities to choose to change that behavior. If we're not engaging with them, we're missing a huge opportunity for that. And as I said, even if it's difficult or virtually impossible to engage with them, we still can hold them accountable in our documentation and in our conversations with survivors. So those are the three principles, and then they have these critical components. And what I really like about this diagram is it's something when we train child welfare workers, we say, this is all the information that you need, right? If you really want to have a clear picture of what's happening in this home, you need to understand what the perpetrator's pattern of behavior is, right? What is that perpetrator actually doing? What is the course of control that's happening in this family that's causing, this the source of risk and harm? We also want to know, what is this perpetrator doing that is directly harming the children? So maybe children, if they are present during the incident, maybe a child is shoved out of the way or gets hit with something that's thrown. Maybe the perpetrator is calling them names, right? Mocking them. So there's actions they may be doing that directly harm the child, right? And then there's actions that may come indirectly that harm the child, maybe not for 6 weeks later or 2 weeks later or 2 years later, right? And so this model really looks at all of those things as well. It really focuses on the full spectrum of the non-offending parent's efforts to promote child safety and well-being, right? So what is that survivor parent, that non-offending parent? What are all the things that they're doing? And we want to document that. We want to ask about that. My experience is so much that they are always doing things to protect their children. And what looks like that may be causing harm to their children. Oftentimes, if you say, hey, why'd you do that? They have a very clear explanation that what looks to us like that didn't seem like the safest thing, why that action was absolutely in the moment what was going to protect the child the most. So checking in with them and really identifying what are they doing and asking them what are they doing. They'll tell us, right? They will tell you what they have been doing to keep their kids safe, and we want to include that in our work. What is the impact of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior on the children, right? It can be emotional, it can be psychological. The overall family functioning may be impacted, right? So maybe the kids, their housing is unstable. Maybe they don't have their basic needs aren't being met because of financial abuse, right? So we really want to identify what are all the impacts, right, direct and indirect, that this perpetrator's pattern is having on the children. And then Candace mentioned too that it really looks at and addresses intersections and intersectionalities. And so again, my experience with domestic violence is that most families who are experiencing domestic violence are not only experiencing domestic violence, right? There's all these other problems and issues that may be going on in the family that are related to and connected to the domestic violence. And so what is the role that substance use or mental health issues is playing in the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, right? In the survivor's ability to access services and treatment. What is their culture, race, gender identity, socioeconomic status? How is that playing a role? Perpetrators take where the survivor is most vulnerable, and that's where they target their tactics, right? And so we need to know kind of what are those intersections and intersectionalities. And Candace, were you going to do this one? I can't.
We can both go ahead.
Okay, yeah, you can go ahead and get them started.
So when we talk about Bonnie mentioned when looking at the components, really looking at all of the perpetrators' patterns of coercive control. What I love about this model is it goes beyond that physical incident. It goes beyond, looking at an incident base, what brought us into the life of the family. It helps us look beyond, physical violence, and did the kids see it, hear it, or were they exposed to it, and lets us look at a much deeper, look more holistically at all of the patterns of behaviors. And so I think what we really need to understand is, it's greater than the presence or absence of physical violence. It really focuses on, coercive control really focuses on the experience of entrapment and deprivation of liberties and control over just day-to-day life, right? So controlling behavior or acts designed to, make the partner, the person subordinate or dependent on the perpetrator, to isolate them from sources of support, to exploit their resources, finances, maybe not allow them to work or go to school, deprive them of means for independence from other family members, from being able to escape the situation, maybe regulating just their day-to-day behavior or monitoring or keeping tabs on them and checking in throughout the day. Coercive control is different than what we see as normal couple problems or disagreements and fights, right? Most couples argue and struggle with shared decision-making and day-to-day decisions around even just parenting, but they oftentimes do that without violence or threats or actions that are depriving the other person's autonomy or sense of self. So, raising your voice during a fight doesn't mean that others will be afraid or feel controlled by you, right? So coercive control is really like actions that are very, it's a systematic attack on the other person's freedom, on their ability to control their own life. It's very, it's very purposeful and planned out. Perpetrators tend to be very self-centered and have a sense of entitlement, and they often believe that their needs come first and that their partner and children should respond to that. So we see that a lot, when there's coercive control in these families. And, it's not caused by a turbulent relationship or an unhealthy dynamic. It's caused by a perpetrator's belief systems, their attitudes, their expectations of what their partner should do for them. So it's really important to remember that even though we've got couples that argue and struggle, if it's coercive control, it's much more deep rooted and it's a systematic attack on somebody's sense of self and their control over day-to-day life. Bonnie, anything you want to add to that?
Nope, I think I want to hear from the people
Yes,
in our
let's
audience.
hear from everybody
Yeah,
else,
I think so.
right?
I'm gonna open up a whiteboard and see if that works. I have a little Zoom trauma from a training I did last week, but it looks like I was able to open up our whiteboard.
Yeah.
And so what we're going to ask you to do here on the whiteboard is, what are some examples of coercive control that you have seen in your work?
Yeah, and so folks, for those of you who haven't ever used a whiteboard, on the left hand of your screen, you'll see a toolbar, and if you hit the T for text, you can then put your mouse on the whiteboard and just start typing, but the T is.
So I see
There you
people
go.
are starting
You got it.
to write in. Yes. And again, if you haven't seen it in your own cases, it's so like the media, the movies, it's just unfortunately, I try to stay away from some domestic violence things, and I think I'll put a movie on or something, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, this movie's about domestic violence. I didn't know that. So it creeps in. And so what are those coercive control tactics? All right, I'm seeing lots of great things coming
Me
in.
too.
Controlling
Keep
money
going.
and transportation, legal control, right? Using someone's immigration status. That's one of those intersectionalities that perpetrators will use. Using the children as pawns, tracking someone with device. Technology abuse is huge, right? There's so many ways perpetrators can use a survivor's technology, or just even social media. Computers, access to emails, so many ways that they use technology to be abusive. Undermining another parent's authority. Isolation is a huge tactic. Revenge porn, someone put up reproductive coercion, right? Where you're not allowing you're interfering with someone's reproductive health, right? Maybe forcing someone to have multiple pregnancies, forcing someone to terminate a pregnancy, not allowing someone to terminate a pregnancy or use birth control. All of those are holding documents and passports, right? That's another place where someone can use those intersectionalities. using fear, tracking someone. Yeah, these are all examples of coercive control. And you can see, right, some of these tactics really are even, we tend to focus on that physical abuse, and is there physical violence or sexual violence? And if they're not, well, then how bad is it? And I can assure you that these tactics of coercive control are as powerful as physical violence, if not some more, because it goes even more so, right? Because it really does deprive someone of their liberty. It limits their ability to make choices and decisions, right? And you have someone that's living in fear, constantly trying to manage that perpetrator and what's coming next. And
I
as I
know,
mentioned earlier, while all this is going on, trying to provide stability and nurturance for their children, right? Trying to maintain basic routines. So they're experiencing all of this, they're trying to manage all of this, and they're still trying to do those things that we talked about, right? Provide emotional and physical safety, help the children heal from the trauma, right? Or prevent the impact of the trauma. And provide consistent routines. Again, one of the things I was always amazed with was people who were suffering severe coercive control, right? Every morning their kids were up, dressed nice, homework done, fed, and out to school, right? And you would never know what had happened in that family the night before, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if we had any in the chat box. I know not everybody might be able to use the whiteboard if they're on a different, if they're on a tablet or something else. So we've also got, they want to stay in consultation rooms. So not allowing the survivor to maybe have that time to share the information, or, really monitoring what they're, I'm sure that that's something that you folks might come into as a barrier a lot. Anything else? Let's see.
And we're giving you guys, this is a kind of a 1 hour overview, and then we're, kind of talking about your particular work that you do and how it relates. There's also a 1 day overview, right? And then the full of this model is 4 as a 4-day training, right? So I just want to be clear, you're getting a little piece of it today. Okay, I'm going to try to stop sharing this whiteboard now.
Okay.
Let's see if that is a thing.
Yeah, I think we got it.
Okay.
All right, we're doing this without any problems. We don't get to use Zoom a lot here. So we have a different platform we use. So the last thing I'm going to say specifically about the model, and something that you would obviously learn more about if you took one of the longer trainings, is this, and I've mentioned it already, the multiple pathways to harm. And this is really, and I love this graphic because I think it really, and even though it's a busy screen, it really just it provides this, more holistic view of all of the ways in which a perpetrator's behaviors, even if it's coercive control towards their adult partner, how those things can impact the children, how those specific actions of coercive control towards their partner, or specific actions taken to harm the children, how those can show up in ways to harm the children. So really looking at how do we highlight, looking at the perpetrator's pattern as a parenting choice. How are their behaviors impacting their kids? Beyond just did they see it, hear it, or witness it, right? How are we really, we know that's one of the ways that they can be victims themselves of abuse, or see or hear or get harmed by it. But we also look at these other things on here, like the effects on family ecology and the effects on partners parenting, and think about how do those things in turn impact the children? How does it impact their behavioral and emotional and social and educational growth? How does that impact their development? This is all real big stuff for you folks in the work that you do, right? You're really looking at those early stages of development and educational, really growing their, ability to learn and, to emotionally regulate and to bond. And so think about how all of those things that you guys just shared on that last screen, how those things might in turn impact the children. And when we do that, we look, really just, we look at that wider range of functioning. So we look at how are we doing a more comprehensive assessment and seeing how those behaviors impact day-to-day functioning in the household. How does it impact, their housing stability? their income, loss of contact with extended family, educational and social disruptions. Think about a survivor that gets displaced from their home because their partner has, called the police, or they've gotten evicted because they couldn't pay the rent because the perpetrator was incarcerated. And now, the survivor's got to move with the kiddos to another location and maybe change schools, or, they might be couch surfing and staying with other family members, or, just think about just that day-to-day disruption on the children and how that might impact them. And even bigger is the effect on the partner's parenting. We definitely know that, acts of coercive control and violence towards a partner can cause things like depression and PTSD and anxiety and substance abuse, as a way of coping with that, right? As a trauma response, sometimes even. And sometimes folks come into relationships with a history of depression, and then they have a person who's, exerting coercive control, and how does that exacerbate or make their mental health issues worse, or their substance abuse issues worse? So really looking at how is that person's behavior impacting the ability for the non-offending parent, for that protective parent, to be responsive to the children, maybe undermining parenting, loss of authority, having to placate the perpetrator instead of attend to a crying infant, right? Because they know that if they don't attend to him first, there's going to be a consequence. So, sometimes, kiddos being, left unattended because the survivor's got to attend to the perpetrator to de-escalate or make sure that the violence isn't going to get worse. So really thinking about those interference of day-to-day routine and basic care, not allowing them to have access to the bank account, to the car. How is that impacting, the survivor's ability just to provide that daily routine, that stability and nurturance, overall family functioning, and really looking at a more holistic way of how their actions impact overall functioning, and how do we get a sense of that, right? Even when we've got small children that are nonverbal, how are we starting to see how the perpetrator's behaviors have impacted them? We're looking at all of those connections between the behavior patterns and the harm to child and family functioning. And so this is a really.
Lorian wants to say something.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you. And I know there's, so much more information to go through, but I want to say, like, sometimes just this slide alone, just this theory alone can be completely life-changing for folks.
Okay.
And, so you talked about perpetration as a parenting choice. That can be a huge aha, changeable moment for child welfare. But I just wanted to say, along with, when I was first getting trained in this model, I had this, printed out and like on my, right in front of my computer, in my office on the wall. But one of the things that I also wanted to just say is, energy goes to addressing the perpetrator instead of children. Now, undermining the partner's parenting is really, really big. But in terms of energy going to addressing the perpetrator instead of children, sometimes that energy goes towards the perpetrator on behalf of the children. And, there's a story that I use all of the time about, a mom who came to the attention of child welfare and therefore home visitation and, all sorts of things, because it was called in by the school. And every once in a while, she would show up to the school. Normally, routines were met, children were everything that you said, Bonnie, right? They're at school, their homework is done, they're lovely, respectful children, everything's fine, they get to school on time. But every once in a while, the school notices that she's dropping the children off late and she smells of alcohol. And so they call it in after, the second or the third time. But what people didn't know was that her partner was an over-the-road trucker. He would come home one week out of the month and expect her to drink and drug with him. And she learned very quickly that if she didn't, she would be punished. He would rant and rave. He would hurt her. He would keep the children up all night. So sometimes that energy going to the perpetrator is really to keep that routine and to protect the children. Now that is a case where it wasn't until somebody was trained in Safe and Together that they could go back and look at, well, that perpetrator and the way they were affecting the family functioning was completely invisible. Right, because they couldn't see it from this paradigm shift. And so I just wanted to add that the effects on the family ecology too can often make a perpetrator invisible, because sometimes we think, well, they have employment instability and that's not their fault. But that employment instability adds to all of this other stuff: food instability, housing, their ability to isolate the family and to isolate their partner from their social networks, from their neighborhoods, from their childcare, educational disruptions. All of that may be something that keeps the perpetrator invisible, because we don't want to blame the perpetrator for all of those things happening in their life, but they get to leverage it, right?
Yeah. And really connecting. I think it's always important to always connect it back. Like, it is the loss of income or housing, and so because of a behavior of the perpetrator, right? Like, did mom lose her job because he kept calling work over and over and over and over again? Right? Like, so always looking back to the behavior that is at the root of the effect, right?
Right.
That's so important. Yeah, really contextualizing the DV perpetrator's behavior into that. How did that behavior in that context impact?
Context and consequences really matter when it comes to this.
Really do.
Yeah.
Really
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I think, the important piece here for home visitors is when we think about all of the ways in which those behaviors can impact, looking at the screen, all the ways in which those behaviors can impact children, even infants, and even during prenatal, right? Like, and I think it's so important to really tie that in with the importance of the work that you're doing. And that's where, Bonnie, I'm going to hand some of that over to you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And so unfortunately, right, there are a lot of intersections around pregnancy and domestic violence. And I know a lot of home visiting programs, right, you're working with those pregnant and early parenting. So Candace mentioned the impact on even very young children, right, of growing up in a home where there's domestic violence or coercive control happening. And even unborn children, right, for women who are pregnant, can be impacted by the coercive control and the abuse that's happening in the home. A World Health study showed that women who had mistimed or unwanted pregnancies reported significantly higher levels of abuse during pregnancy compared with those pregnancies, and that women are 4 times more likely to suffer increased abuse as a result of unintended or unwanted pregnancy. So unfortunately, pregnancy and coercive control and domestic violence often go hand in hand. And what the data ignores is that pregnancy itself can be the result of coercive control or domestic violence. Right. So if your partner is not allowing you to use birth control, right, and then is raping you, and then forcing you then to not be able to make any decisions or choices about that pregnancy in and of itself can be a result of the domestic violence. Lorian just shared a story, and I will share one that I'm not proud of from early in my career, where we were working with a family, and I actually had the perpetrator in a class. And their partner and them had, I don't know, 3 or 4 children. All of those children were placed in foster care. And my judgment and my bias came in, right, as to why would this woman, this mother, right, keep giving up these children and putting them in foster care, right? Why is she putting this abusive partner ahead of the needs of her children, and just keeps getting pregnant and keeps putting children in the system? Luckily, those words never came out of my mouth ever. But I will be lying if I didn't say that those judgments weren't in my head. And years later, I came to work with that survivor in a very different context. And she shared with me that when she was in relationship with that person, that he raped her, that all of those pregnancies were a result of him raping her, and that she did not fight to get those kids back from foster care because she knew they would be safer in the foster care system than in their own home. And she had been told numerous times if she were to leave her partner, that he would kill her and the children. Right. So my awful judgment, right, my domestic violence destructive mind early in my career, and my biases was really blaming her, right? And it was so wrong. And so it's such a powerful example for me, right, of what looks like one thing can be something very, very different. The pregnancies were not her choices, and she was really providing for the safety for those children by not fighting to take them back. And she wasn't choosing to keep having more kids and give them away. She had no choice as to whether or not she was pregnant and giving birth. So those are some powerful intersections. 324,000 women who experience domestic violence each year are pregnant at the time. It's often surprising to people that the number of women who are experiencing domestic violence while pregnant, and that often domestic violence escalates during pregnancy. Right, getting or keeping a survivor pregnant can be a tactic of coercive control. So we just talked a little bit about that, right? If I can keep you pregnant, and then you may be more dependent on me, right? Because now it's not just that you have to worry about. You have this pregnancy and maybe these other children. And I think the other thing here is the connection to homicide, and this is a kind of a scary statistic, but I think the worst case scenarios of these cases, right, where there's not interventions, they sometimes unfortunately do end in homicide. And homicide is a leading cause of traumatic death for pregnant women and postpartum women, accounting for 31% of maternal injury deaths, right? And so if you're doing work with pregnant and postpartum women and families, you will have domestic violence caseloads. And so I've referenced reproductive coercion, and that really is a form of sexual violence where one partner exerts power and control over their other partner's reproductive health. And so it may look like a partner refusing to use condoms or taking off condoms during the middle of sex without permission, destroying or throwing away birth control, using violence or threats to, or coercion to cause or end a pregnancy. And so I think it's really important in the work that you do, right, that we recognize that pregnancy time and that immediately after, when we have very young infants, that may be a really dangerous time for survivors of domestic violence.
Yeah, and a lot of you noted that some of those, some reproductive coercion tactics
Yes,
on
the board. Yes.
So, so obviously it's something that you are definitely seeing. And we know that rates of domestic violence incidents disclosed by parents were more than double what child welfare workers identify. So when we were doing some research around, the co-occurrence with child abuse and maltreatment, we know it's 30 to 60%, but we also know that it's significantly underreported and not always fully assessed, not in a holistic way, not unless there's an incident-based or, we're missing those other pieces. And so, for all you folks, if you think about that in the context of child welfare, think about that in the context of the work that you're doing. And you have that opportunity to provide young and vulnerable parents and parents to be, you have that opportunity to provide them with a range of services and skills and supports and links to community providers and, and all of those things to keep kiddos and the families healthy and safe and, ready to learn. And, so when we think about a prevention tool, home visitation is one of those really successful prevention, primary prevention tools that we have. And we know how effective it is in reducing child abuse and neglect. And, think about, how isolated some of these young survivors are that you might be coming into contact with, and how much of an impact you can have if those assessments are being made during that early work with these families during those earlier intervention periods. It's huge, the impact that you could have. And we know that when through studies, historically through studies, that the effectiveness of your efforts in home visitation is significantly diminished and might even disappear when mothers are being victimized by an intimate partner. So if in order to reach full potential in those prevention efforts, so important that screening and for domestic violence is happening, referrals to services, that awareness, ability to talk to survivors and perpetrators about the behaviors and how they might be impacting children, really looking at how can you integrate that DV assessment into your referrals and interventions and safety planning and all of that, because we know that all of those efforts, to improve child and maternal health and those pregnancy outcomes and those emotional and cognitive developments can be so impacted by domestic violence if it's not being addressed. So really just showing how so important it is for all of you in your roles. So let's talk about, Bonnie, you're going to share a whiteboard.
Yes, I am going to share.
Let's talk about some of the barriers that you folks experience in your roles as home visitors.
Yeah, what's challenging?
And feel free to put stuff in the chat if folks can't use the whiteboard. Feel free to put things in the chat, but give us some of those challenges, those barriers that you have faced in your work with families.
Right, limited time, right? Time is always, right? It's so hard. And you're there to do this other thing, right? You have your own other role. And so I think kind of, we're asking you to think about this, right? But ultimately what we're going to ask you to do is, if you identify domestic violence, to hopefully make those referrals to domestic violence service providers, right? It's not our expectation that you're doing all of this domestic violence work, but as Candace said, domestic violence is going to interfere with your ability to support and help families with your primary purpose of being there, right? Yes, canceling visits because they don't want to see what is going on. Yes, fear of visit, not ready, access to mental health services, unreal expectations of home, right? These are all challenges. And it's so great to hear from this audience what the challenges are. They're similar to many of the audiences that we work with, right? A fear of maybe making things worse, or not being able, or missing it, or not recognizing it, right? Those are some of the things that we hear. Not having services available, right? And it may not be safe for them to be meeting with you, right? The perpetrator may not want you in their house, in their business. And so they may cancel appointments. They may seem a little withdrawn or reluctant to engage. You may notice a big difference when the perpetrator is in the home, or the partner's in the home, versus when the partner's not in the home. Those are kind of all red flags and things that you want to pay attention to, right? And if you have the opportunity, right, or if that survivor does confide in you and talk to you, right, how can you partner with them and say, how can I help keep you safe? What do you need from me? Right. Our biases can get in our way also.
Yeah. And I want to just highlight something that Kelly shared in the chat, that a lot of folks that she works with think she's a county worker, and having been screwed over by perhaps a county worker that had been involved with a family in the past. And so don't want to work with her. And oh my gosh, like that's something that happens all the time. Even for caseworkers getting a case that had another caseworker that handled it in a really poor manner before, right? Or let's say another system had to respond, whether it be law enforcement or even temporary assistance, and how maybe the survivor was treated. And so now they don't have faith in the system or with those helpers that are being brought in to help. So that's a real challenge that folks feel, for sure.
And that leads right into our next slide. So thank you for the transition.
That was perfect.
It was perfect.
Bonnie and Candace, while you're getting that next slide up, I'm gonna pop in with a time check. I know there's so much to talk about.
Yes, that's right. Oh gosh.
It's 11:15.
I know. I've been watching the time.
Okay.
So obviously you have 3 people here who love this model and really love this work. And so there's so many things we want to share with you, but I want to point out why survivors do not disclose, because I think that's some of the frustration, right, that home visitors have, that any system has, right? And as Candace was saying, maybe they've reached out to the system before and the system has failed them, right? Maybe they were at increased risk or harm because of how a system responded. So that may make them less likely to want to share. They may be afraid of losing their kids. They may be afraid of retaliation from their abusive partner, right? They've probably been threatened. You better not tell anyone what's going on, or no one will believe you. They may be ashamed. They may be embarrassed. They may not even recognize that they are a victim of domestic violence, right? If they're associating domestic violence with physical abuse only, and there's no physical abuse, they're not going to tell you because they don't understand. Survivors often blame themselves. They want to protect their children, their pets, other family members. So they're always operating out of fear. The abusive partner may have told them not to trust the system, that they will harm them or increase the risk of harm if they do confide in other systems. There's all kinds of reasons why survivors don't share. And again, though, if we look at those reasons and why they're not disclosing in the context of the perpetrator's pattern of behavior, it starts to make a lot of sense why they're not saying, hey, this is what's going on. Oftentimes they've made a decision that it's not safe for them to confide in you or disclose in you, or there's been some negative response when they've done that in the past. And so I think it's really important to remember that it's not that survivors don't want help, right? It's that it may not be safe for them to ask for help and confide in you. And so it's building that relationship, partnering with over time, building trust, helping them to see you as a resource that is going to make them feel more comfortable to disclose to you. Can we go to the next slide, Candace?
Yes, ma'am.
And so there you may see all kinds of indicators in a home visit of what's happening, right? You may see people with unexplained injuries or making excuses for those injuries. They may be wearing a turtleneck to hide bruising from a strangulation in the summer, or have a scarf always around their neck. They may stop socializing. You may notice over your time with the family that survivor's life is smaller and smaller and smaller. That perpetrator may be using the tactic of isolation and not allowing them to communicate with other family members or friends. When you are there visiting, the perpetrator may always be right there or may never be right there, right? Or maybe constantly texting, I want to come home, we got to get that person out of the house. What are you saying? Remember, you better not say anything. Or constantly calling, right? And interrupting the visits. Those are all things that could be red flags, things that you want to pay attention to. They may not have money on time. They may be really worried or anxious about their partner coming home during the visit. You may notice destruction of property, holes in the walls, broken or missing toys or furniture, right? None of these are guarantees that domestic violence is happening, but they're all things that you want to be aware of and pay attention to. I'm going to turn it back to Candace now.
Okay. Yeah, so knowing, you know, this domestic violence has a measurable and substantial association with overall caregiver and family functioning. We talked about the multiple pathways to harm, which then in turn has impact on child health and their behavior. So really helps us understand that the perpetrator's behavior is not just associated with the witnessing of the violence or just the physical violence, but really strongly correlated with you know, degradation of child, caregiver, and family functioning. And so just some of the impacts that we might see on infants and toddlers, you know, we're trying to focus primarily on the age groups that you folks are coming into contact with. You know, loud noises and vivid visual images can be associated that are associated with physical violence can be very distressing to infants and toddlers. The parents might not be, I mentioned earlier, might not be able to consistently respond to an infant's needs, which could negatively impact that bond. Fear and instability could inhibit exploration and play. Imitating play might be related or to witnessed aggression. You know, we know that infants need to form secure attachments, to learn basic needs, trust that basic needs will be met, that they need to develop the capacity to self-soothe when stressed, to learn about those relationships with family members, and infants that are exposed to domestic violence, we know can show signs of trauma like failure to thrive. So eating problems, sleeping disturbances, higher levels of colic, higher irritability, delays in their development. And so making sure that we are, you know, assessing for that and keeping those in mind when working with infants, and then preschoolers. These are our kiddos that need to learn appropriately how to express their feelings and emotions, right? They're emotionally regulated. How are they able to learn those things and to make observations about the world and apply meaning to it? They tend to be very egocentric in their ways, and they tend to, this is during the time when they're looking to increase physical independence and to become developing their self-esteem and their self-confidence. And so when they are exposed to coercive control and domestic violence, they could really be getting some conflicting messages about, how they're interacting with others and learn unhealthy ways for expressing anger. And they could attribute the violence to something, making it their fault, something that they've done. So really looking at that, how can that impact kiddos at that age? Bonnie.
And so I mentioned there's so many ways. My career started working with children that had been exposed to domestic violence. So that is kind of always where my heart is. And it really can impact every asset of a child's life. It can impact how they think, how they behave, how they feel, what their beliefs are about relationships. It can impact their physical and mental health. They may feel that they can't trust people. They may start to learn that power and control and love go together. And so they may use substances, just like survivors may use substances as a way to cope or engage in risk-taking behavior as they get older. We see a lot, think about adolescents who are growing up, and you may see a lot of mental health impacts and substance use impacts as children get older. And we know from the Adverse Childhood Experience study, and if you're not familiar with that, go to the CDC and look it up and Google it. But we know that children who are exposed to trauma, and domestic violence is trauma, right, are going to have significant, the potential for significant health impacts throughout their life. And so it's important for us to recognize that children, they may be impacted by this, right? And that the impact is not the same for all children. It varies, depending on the child and depending on what protective factors are available and their gender and how long they're exposed to the abuse. But there's a lot of potential impacts for children who are experiencing domestic violence. The one thing that we know that mitigates some of that risk and harm that comes to children is a relationship with one positive, supportive adult. And oftentimes that is going to be the survivor or the non-offending parent, but it could also be a home visitor. It could be a coach. It could be a teacher. But what we know mitigates this is a positive, supportive relationship. And so looking at what protective factors are in place that mitigate the risk and the harm that comes to children is important. And so I mentioned protective factors. I want to make sure that we get to activity and hear a little bit from you what you're taking out of this. But I think it's really critical that this model is a strength-based model and that we recognize and acknowledge all that survivors are doing to protect their children and how that does reduce the likelihood of risk and harm to the children.
Yeah. And I think Bonnie had mentioned this a little bit earlier when going over the principles, that when we're talking about safety, we're talking about physical and emotional safety. What are all of the ways in which the survivor is working to promote physical and emotional safety, to promoting stability and nurturance? What are the ways in which they are, really providing that ongoing resilience, through using play and allowing kiddos to talk about what's going on and spending time with them and making sure that they're exposed to other positive role models and other adults, and also the healing from trauma. So making sure that, the kids are able to, use resources and support, that they're able to share their feelings about it, and to really encourage them to be a part of, therapy that's specific to the child and survivor.
And I think the other thing that we want to make sure that you're aware of, right, is that children are the prime consideration for survivors, right? When they're making those decisions, am I leaving? Am I staying? Am I going to confide in someone? All of those decisions and choices they're making, they are considering the best interest of their child when they're making those decisions and choices. And so I think it's critical that we remember that. I think it's also critical that we keep our own personal safety in mind. Candace is going to share with you a safety card that Safe and Together has, and really, make sure that if you have concerns about a case, that you're trusting your gut right? That you're letting supervisors know when you're going into homes where you have some concerns. I used to always text on my way in, text on my way out, know where exit strategies are. And I think our own personal safety is critical also. And if something doesn't feel safe for us, we need to say, you know what, I think I'm going to come back another time, or I feel like this conversation would be better had at another place. And so we'll share that information.
Yeah.
with you. And again, I mentioned earlier, we don't expect you guys to be domestic violence experts, right? We just want you to be able to recognize and respond in ways that are appropriately to get people to the experts and to domestic violence service providers, if that's what the survivor wants and is comfortable with. And so I want to make sure that everyone is aware there are 92 licensed domestic violence programs in New York State, and you can access those through the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline number. And they provide more. I think we often think of it's just shelter, but they provide so much more than shelter, right? They provide advocacy and support groups. They can accompany people to court, can help with transitions or moving as people are heading out. And then Candace, why don't you wrap it up?
Yeah, so I know I really wanted to get some takeaways from folks and see what other things might be helpful in the future for this. I'm so sorry that we ran out of time. This is really, it's a lot to go over. But really, you know, we want you to keep in mind, you know, this something positive is really, we know that family engagement has shown that the quality of the worker's relationship with family members significantly impacts the outcomes for children and families. So knowing that families are directly impacted by how a worker is engaging with them and whether or not they're listening to their unique concerns and their perspectives, or if being respected in their parenting role, follows through with commitments. You know, those things are also so important. And we know that's a big part of the work that you're doing with families. And so just to keep that in mind when working with survivors of domestic violence and kiddos and even perpetrators, just really that engagement piece and focusing on, you know, how you can help.
And I think Candace, we could either do the whiteboard or maybe just people could put in the chat on their way out, what's one takeaway or something that was helpful to them that they think they can use in their work. Because we do want to know how you can use this material in the work that you're doing with families. And so if people wouldn't mind taking a second and dropping that in the chat, and then I think Maggie can save the chat and we'll at least have that information. And then our contact information so that if anyone wants to follow up or reach out. I know that Candace and I are both always happy to hear from people. We love to talk about this stuff. We love to know how it applies to other systems. We're going to be doing a lot more work. Lorian's put hers information in the chat box too. So if you have any questions or comments or feedback, like I said, we all love to talk about this and we love to know how it applies in other systems. So please reach out to any of us. We're happy to hear from you.
And I will absolutely save the chat. And as folks are dropping off, I just want to give another quick reminder that I will be in touch with a follow-up email with information and resources, the safety card that Candace and Bonnie talked about today. I know there's a couple other pamphlets and resources that we want to share. There will be a link to our Center for Human Services Research survey link. Since the HVCI is a project of a P5 grant, we love to collect feedback from our participants so we can make sure these webinars continue to happen. So thank you so much. I want to give a huge thank you to Bonnie and Candace and to Lorian, our partners at OPDV and Niskative and OCFS. This was a really wonderful session, and I think we had a really rich conversation. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a great rest of your day. We'll be in